Okay, so it's 12:02, so in the interest of timeliness, we'll go ahead and get going and started with the webinar today. My name is Rachel Massey. I'm the Executive Director of the UNO Alumni Association. I'm so pleased to have you all with us today for another of our virtual Meet Us At webinar series. Today, our session is going to focus on leading remote teams, both during and after COVID-19, something I am certainly becoming very familiar with, as I'm sure many of you are as well. Very pleased to welcome Kimberly Putnam as our guest speaker today. Kimberly Putnam's an executive career coach and executive teams coach. She also is an instructor within our PACE unit, that's our Center for Continuing Education here at UNO. We're really pleased to have her with us today. She's really an expert in this area, and I think we're going to get a lot of good tips from her. So throughout the presentation, you can use the chat function to type in any questions you might have. Kimberly's going to be taking pauses at various points in the presentation to answer your questions. So just be patient and she'll get to you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly and I'll be back to see you and tie things up at the end. Okay, thank you.
Hi everybody, welcome to our discussion on leading remote teams. I'm gonna have my video open here for just a second and then I'm gonna turn it off so that there's no distraction while we're all talking. Just to give you a little bit more background about myself and my experience, as Rachel was saying, I do a lot of executive coaching, working with people from every level of leadership, whether they're high potentials or in the C-suite. I also work with college students and adults that have executive function and ADHD challenges, working with them as both a coach and a tutor. I love doing events like this as a facilitator and a trainer. As Rachel also said, I do some career development work as well. So people that are looking to have strategy in their career, how to grow in their career, need to pivot in times like these, or unfortunately, if they've lost their job and need to be reemployed. I work a lot with clients in that vein as well. I do small business consulting, and then probably one of my favorite things is the higher ed instructing that I do, particularly with UNO. So again, as Rachel said, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box as we go along today. I will just pause during the session just to kind of be able to answer those along the way. So I'm going to turn off my video now and we can get started. So thank you for joining me on this journey today. We're going to be talking about leading remote teams. And my goal is that by the end of the presentation today, that you have a better understanding of how to lead a remote team and really have some tools that will help you on this leadership journey. And I use that word journey in a very intentional way because in all of the leadership classes that I teach, one of the things that we talk about is that the path to great leadership is a journey. It is not a sprint. It's definitely a marathon. We don't get there overnight. I certainly do not consider myself a great leader. I consider myself a leader on this journey to getting better every day. And there is a lot of intentional work and personal development that we need to do to get there. So in thinking about the journey that we're on today, the outcomes that I want you to have are these three. What are the challenges that we have of leading remote teams? What's potentially the silver lining of working with remote teams? And then ultimately, what are some tips and tools for how to better manage remote teams? I want to give a nod to the Sanger Leadership Center at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, as well as Dr. Lindy Greer, who is the faculty director of the Sanger Leadership Center. She is also a top professor and researcher in the field of management, organizations, and organizational psychology. And a lot of the work that they have done is excellent, and it is a great deal of the things that we're going to talk about today are based on a lot of the research that they have done. So although this webinar is only about 45 minutes, I do want you to keep in mind, again, that word journey. The concepts that we're going to talk about are really actually pretty simple. Leadership concepts are simple, but the reality is the execution of those can be tough. And we know that the sudden shift to remote work due to the pandemic that's happening right now can be the start of this journey. And I want you to take away the opportunity that you have to improve overall in business, in operations and human capital management as a result of what has happened with the pandemic. It's basically the silver lining. So when you think about what we have to do to move to remote work, there's an opportunity for the entire business to improve because of this new normal. And there's a lot of research actually to back up this claim. Things from higher productivity from working at home to higher worker satisfaction because of their ability to work at home. And there can be an overall improvement in business functions because management is now having to be incredibly intentional about the techniques that are required to work remotely. So I actually want to share with you my own personal story of what happened when COVID-19 started to impact my business. So I typically work remote from my team. So my staff works together and I work remotely from my team, and I travel back and forth between two cities. And because of COVID-19, I actually re-entered the part of the business where my staff works, and just really re-entered like it was any other re-entry, and didn't really think about what that was going to be like because I come back and forth all of the time. What was different about my re-entry this time was the duration. My staff was absolutely not used to having me around all of the time, and it started to wear them out. The normal level of autonomy that they had was suddenly very, very different. And I must admit that, despite the fact that I teach the concept of leading remote teams and leadership, I actually failed to recognize that this was a giant change for them. And about 3 weeks into hunkering down in the office, they kind of, I have to say, exploded on me and let me know their feelings. And it was really important that I had, pivoted my behavior really quickly. And, we recovered, we talked about it. I apologized for my lack of foresight and understanding of how it was for them in this new normal with having me around as opposed to having me remote. And I learned a very valuable lesson, which is, that you have to practice what you teach. So whether you're suddenly working remote, or in my case, I am suddenly working not remote, it's really important to be very thoughtful and reflective about changes that happen. So what I would like to ask is if any of you have any stories that you'd like to share about what remote work has done in terms of affecting the people aspect of your business, feel free to share some of those in the chat box. And as we go along, I'm going to read those out and kind of look at what kind of themes that may be happening across different organizations, whether you are a local small business or part of a national or global organization and have suddenly gone remote. I think it would be really interesting to sort of share what are the things that your organizations are doing to tackle the challenge of remote work. What are the processes and procedures that have improved? What are the processes and procedures that are lacking? And so you can imagine with all of these changes that there is that opportunity for businesses to improve. But at the same time, there is a chance that remote work can actually magnify problems. For example, when we think about any kind of underlying people industry or people issues in companies, those can be glossed over sometimes in face-to-face interactions, but they can tend to explode really quickly when companies go remote. So why is this? And that's really getting to the heart of what we're going to talk about today. and that has to do with social cues, right? So when we are working remotely, you can't actually use social cues to overlook any of the people issues that are happening. So small social cues that can usually smooth social interactions go away when you're working remotely, and the underlying conflicts become more obvious, and then the efforts at coordination and collaboration can become roadblocks much, much more quickly. So to make it really simple, our common human challenges with communication, conflict management, and even motivation, which I'm sure some people are struggling with, those things are much more easily solved in person than they are in a remote environment. So what we've learned from this new normal of remote work is that companies are going to have to be incredibly intentional about the people dynamics when they are working remotely. So again, there's that word intentional. So how do we become more intentional? In short, we really have to think about what are the foundations of our business that we need to underscore and highlight so that we can help ease the gap, I guess, between what is missing in remote environments versus what is happening when you are live and in person. So if what is missing in those remote working environments are the social connections that can happen organically when we're in person, what are some of the things that we can do as companies to promote social connection and communication richness in this newly remote culture, right? So if anybody has any of those ideas, what are the things that your companies are doing to promote social connections and communication richness? Let us know in the chat box, because I'd love to see what kind of commonalities that we have. Some ideas that I have seen work really well in organizations that I've worked with have to do with providing technical infrastructure that really helps coordinate and assist the staff in communication. Things like what we're using today, Zoom. Some companies are using Google Hangouts, some are using GoToMeetings, some are setting up or already have Slack channels or other instant messaging systems. Companies are also working to establish some really clear norms around, what are we going to do in our virtual meetings? What's the etiquette going to be? Does everybody have to be dressed and look put together? What kind of norms do we have when we're going to have these virtual meetings and internal communications? Some companies are organizing things like virtual coffee rooms so that people can jump in, and just like they would go down to the break room, they can jump into a virtual coffee room and have just some social bonding time. I see in the chat box, some people are having those, online social hours. I've known lots of companies that are doing things like that. They're having online cooking events and online, it's not musicals, music playing and sharing, little concerts. That's what I was trying to say. They're hosting other kinds of fun and interactive video sessions. I've even heard of people playing bingo. Companies are initiating new recognition programs so that people that are doing great work, they're getting acknowledged and recognized throughout the organization, even though people are not live and in person. And one of the most important things that I have seen are virtual town halls. These are really an opportunity for the organization to have an open forum where feedback and issues relating to remote work or any company challenges actually can be discussed without the fear of retribution. That's the idea, that town hall, where everybody from every level comes in to a facilitated session, and a virtual town hall is hosted, and people can talk about what are the things that they need, what are the things that they're missing, what are the challenges that they have, and potentially even talk about some of the solutions. So, those are some of the things that we can do to promote social connection and communication richness. But what I want to say is that, working remotely really can help you improve the organization overall when we do get really intentional about how to maintain or even improve communication and relationships. So as a leadership coach, I spend a lot of time talking to organizations about being intentional about the foundations of a good business all of the time, right? So whether you're remote or live and in person, being really clear about what are the foundations of your business are really important when you go remote, so that people fully understand what are the foundations of our business and how do we use them to help us interact appropriately every day. Do we understand the mission of our company? Why are we here? Do we understand how we want to be seen, so that we understand, again, how are we promoting why we are here? What are our company values? These are the things that are going to drive the social interactions that we have, our communications, our cultural environment. Those are the types of things that we need to be really intentional about when we go remote. How do we promote and animate the culture that we have when we're not together? Those types of virtual events, things like those social hours, the meetings that we're having virtually, what are we doing during those business meetings to really underscore what our values are as a company, what our culture is? When we go remote, it's even more important that everybody in the organization understands the business strategy, so that they can make more independent decisions, because that's no doubt going to happen. There's more asynchronous or communication that's not happening at the same time with everybody. And so having an understanding of what the business strategy is really important, so that you can make strong business decisions that are in line with the business strategy. Keeping in mind, what are the principles of the business? These are the things that guide our behavior based on what our values are. Do we know what our workplace principles are? We're going to talk later about a company that does an amazing job teaching everyone in their company about what their values are. They know their mission, they know their vision, they know their values. They're very clear on their culture. They certainly are clear on the strategy, and it's their guiding principles that help people make decisions every day. And then, of course, when we go remote, we have to be really clear about what our workplace habits are, what are work ethic norms, because these are going to change. People are working from home now. They have children, they have the elderly, they have all kinds of responsibilities at home that they never had when they were in the workplace. So, building a strong remote operation is really about having that support system that is really underscoring all of these foundational items. So we want to re-clarify to the staff the mission and all of the things that are on this list here. That's really important. And how you decide to re-clarify those foundations of the organization, that's going to be part of what your cultural norm is. Does your CEO put together a video and share that with everybody? Does he come on and do a live broadcast? Does she write a letter to everyone and have a written correspondence that's explaining, and being very transparent about what kind of decisions are being made in the organization? What are the things that the leaders in our organization are doing to re-clarify all of these things and helping to build some additional culture or cultural norms in this new normal? What are the things, that they are doing? And what are the out-of-the-box ideas that can happen with animating that culture in a virtual way, right? So the things like the virtual happy hours, the online concerts, the cooking demonstrations, sharing things about your pets and your kids, things that help build relationships. Creating these clear rules of engagement that we're going to have during our online engagements. That's really important as well, because these can have an enormous impact on the emotional energy. And when I say emotional energy, I know everyone kind of says, Another Zoom call. It's exhausting. There is research that absolutely says that having meetings virtually taps our energy in a different way. And so making sure that you are cognizant of the emotional, I see other people are saying, yes, very exhausting, the emotional energy that we are expending on all of this virtual interaction is very, very different from in-person interactions. So again, going back to the idea of strategy, when leadership in this time of change can remind everybody, what is our value proposition? How is it that we do what we do, and what are our priorities? It gives people the security, again, to continue behaving in the ways that they would have at work, but also having a little more autonomy in making decisions, because they're going to need to be able to do that because everyone is not working as collaboratively as they normally would be, because it's asynchronous. So now that we have some tools for strengthening our business foundations and communications, let's talk a little bit about the differences between remote teams and face-to-face teams. So the obvious is that we have less communication richness, okay? So what does that really mean? You know, communication richness. It means that we are receiving fewer social cues over emails or calls, or even sometimes Zooms, than we would in face-to-face communications. And as I've said several times, we're having a lot of asynchronous communication. What does that mean? That means I send you an email, you receive it whenever, you open it whenever, you respond whenever. And during all of that time that's passing, after I've sent you an email, I might be making a ton of assumptions about what you are or are not doing, because I can't see what you're doing. And so one of the things that tends to happen in this low communication richness environment is that negative assumptions go up. People start assuming everyone's not working as hard as me. My staff must not be working at all. All they're doing is gardening all day long. In fact, I saw somebody with a sunburn the other day. Clearly, they're not working. And so one of the things that's really, really important when we are working remotely is to get intentional about checking in. Whether you're talking about, you know, where you are in a project or just staying connected, letting people know via your calendar or via Slack where you are on a project, that you're stepping away from the desk, that you're going to have to do some homeschooling with your kid, whatever it is, increasing the amount of communication, whether it's, you know, synchronous because you're on Slack or you're on a Zoom call, or asynchronous because you're sending an email or updating your calendar. If you increase your communication, you're going to reduce negative assumptions. So what are the things, I'm curious, again, if you could type into the chat box and let me know some of the things that your companies are doing to deal with the reduction in communication richness. And I'll share some of those as people start to type in, you know, some ideas that I'm seeing across the city. But another layer to our discussion about communications and working relationships has to do with other types of communication challenges. So when we work remotely in the same city, certain things like time zones or cultural differences or cultural norms may not be an issue. But if you work in a national or a global organization and you're now working with people more that are even more spread out, what are the challenges that arise with that? You know, you have to learn about what are the things you need to be culturally sensitive about. What are the holidays that may be happening in other parts of the world? What are the work norms that are happening in other cultures? What are their workflow processes? Is it considered okay to reach out to someone outside of working hours? And some of those things are really important to focus on educating yourself, right? So these working at home scenarios are new for everybody, and we need to be just very mindful that you may not be aware of what the challenges are that other people, that your coworkers are having. They may not be comfortable sharing them. They may not feel confident that they will retain their job if they reveal the fact that they are in fact caring for their children, or caring for an elder, or doing homeschooling, or whatever those things may be. But educating yourself and making sure that you can relate to issues of cultural sensitivity is really, really, again, important when working with even more highly dispersed teams. So again, one of the things that companies can do is be intentional about establishing what are our new norms around communications, what are going to be our processes and systems that can help create transparency so that everybody does understand, hey, you know what my workday looks like may not look like what someone else's workday looks like, but in fact, we are all working, and there's no need to go down what I call negative assumption land, which often leads to micromanaging, anger, and frustrations, some of the things that we're going to talk about. So work ethic is one other area of, I guess, cultural sensitivity that we need to think of. And when I use the work ethic concept, people sometimes are confused and think about, what does that mean? How hard someone works? Not necessarily. What it really means is, think about how other people structure their day. What are their lunch times? Do they work over lunch? Do they step away from their computer? What are the time of day that they start work and end work? When they take off from work, do they cease all communications? These are all the types of things that need to be established in organizations on a normal basis, but certainly need to be revisited when we go remote. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the differences between remote teams and face-to-face teams, what are some of the similarities? Oh, I see a couple of people. So lots of people are talking about being exhausted with the Zoom calls, and that they're not seeing as much innovation in terms of how things can be improved in terms of social interactions. So hopefully over time, as companies get more comfortable and get more systems and processes in place, we will see some more creativity in those social interactions. So back to the idea of what is similar between remote teams and face-to-face teams. One of them is the fact that frustrations can happen really, really quickly if you don't communicate well and you don't communicate swiftly. So when you're working remote, again, it's very, very easy to start thinking about assumptions as opposed to thinking about reaching out and asking really good questions so that you can reduce any kind of lack of transparency or lack of understanding or any frustration that you may be feeling. So communicate immediately or swiftly, and communicate very clearly. What are the things that are potentially frustrating? What are the things that need to be smoothed over pretty quickly? So in terms of the types of solutions, right, that we're talking about, we've said we need to be very, very intentional about our communication processes. What are the expectations that organizations have for their managers in terms of checking in with staff? Are the managers aware that they really should be touching base with their staff, not just checking on projects, but just checking on people's well-being, just like they would be if we were live and in person? Finding some kind of routine tends to help with not just communication, but workflows. What are the other needs that people have? So if you're a manager or a leader, what are the ways that you are going to authentically identify what your staff needs to be able to cope in this new normal? because people may not be comfortable reaching out and saying, my home office isn't working for me. My Wi-Fi situation is abominable. I only have, one screen, and I'm expected to, go over some, difficult technical information while also on a Zoom call. Things that, you take for granted when you're in the office. But what is it that people need to be able to cope? Do they need shorter working days, shorter working hours, more time off, less meetings, more meetings? What are the things that you need to identify that your staff needs? And as a leader, I think it's really important to start thinking about the idea of situational awareness. Know what people need and then work to meet those needs. And it's not always easy to identify those needs when you're not in person, because again, if you're not asking the questions and you're not opening up the door for people to tell you what's going on, then you're not going to know, and people are going to get frustrated really, really quickly. So one of the solutions is to take the time to do one-on-ones with your direct reports and make sure that you do understand what their needs are. And if there's a layer below them, what are they doing to reach out to the people below them? Are you sending out emails that meet or that reach more than just your direct reports? Are you being really transparent in terms of the communications? So again, finding out what are the emotions and what are the energy of the staff. What do people need to be productive? What are the resources that they may need? In an office, everyone has access to printing, scanning, filing, paper, all of the types of things that when I can think of several companies that I work with that went remote so quickly that, they were basically throwing laptops at people and hoping for the best. And after several weeks, they continued working, but there's just not the type of resources that people typically have at their fingertips to be able to produce quality work. And so what are the things that you need to do as a leader to smooth over the frustrations of staff that really do want to do a good job, but may not feel set up for success? So making sure that the organization updates policies and figures out how to perhaps secure some funding to help employees set up that comfortable workspace at home. That's not something that's available to every organization, but it is something to think about. What is it that we can do as an organization to set employees up for success when they may be particularly frustrated by a lack of resources? And then I think the last solution, and the one that I think, again, is really important, is to figure out how to do an energy or culture check-in with your team. You may do this with a meeting at the end of the week. You may adapt that as you start to get feedback. You may decide that you want to do some kind of anonymous culture check, like a survey, something that gets you the kind of feedback that you're going to need to adjust. So I will say that, again, in my coaching practice, I'm noticing a lot of questions from managers and leaders about how to actually do some of this checking in with staff. And not necessarily the checking in about work. They don't have a trouble checking in about what the staff is doing in terms of projects, but they are having some trouble creating authentic check-ins for that sort of non-work related emotional energy stuff. And really what that reveals is that they had not worked hard enough on building the kind of relationships they needed before going remote. So again, when you're a leader, whether you're working remotely or working face-to-face, one of the things that I strongly encourage is that you build that personal rapport with the staff. There's a tool called the Gallup Q12, and it is a survey that measures employee engagement. And one of the questions on that survey talks about someone at work cares about me, right? Quote, someone at work cares about me. And employees really want to know that someone usually, someone that they work with, someone that is their boss, cares about them as a person. And so being able to establish that kind of relationship, again, whether it's in person before you go remote or as a remote leader, it's really, really critical, because you're going to need that in order to be able to check in with people to see how they're doing. And so again, this is another opportunity to underscore those foundational qualities that you need as a leader to be able to be successful leading a remote team. So again, establishing that sort of caring relationship before you go remote or while you are remote is really, really important. I'd love to see some comments in the chat box about experiences with their either with their staff checking in and seeing how people are doing, or any kind of check-ins that you've had or received from your boss. Has anyone had really good ones? Anyone that has seen something that or felt something that was a little awkward and wasn't as natural as maybe they would like to see it? I've heard both ends of the spectrum from clients, and so I'd love to see comments about what it feels like to be sort of checked in on an emotional level. As we wind up our talk today, one of the things I really want to focus on are the focus areas of leading teams. So when we think about whether or not we are live and in person or remote, there are 4 key areas that really need to be addressed on every team. The first one is something that I've harped on throughout this time, which is culture and the work of building culture. So whether you are moving towards, going into a remote situation or you are in a remote situation, you want to make sure that there is a developed value-based culture that is really meaningful to the people in the organization. So, what does that mean? Do we know what our values are, and do we animate those in the way that we behave at work every day? And can you transfer that from live and in person to remote work? And how do you do that in an authentic way? One suggestion is creating a culture committee that can help come up with these innovative ideas on how to socialize remotely. I have seen, actually I can think of an advertising agency in New Orleans that has a culture committee, and one of the things that they have done is come up with some novel ways on a weekly basis for the organization to have an optional social check-in towards the end of the week. So that's the first area, culture work. The second area has to do with objectives. So when we're talking again about the foundations of a team, we need to know, what is our shared objective? Is it clear? Is it fair? Is it, again, meaningful and motivating? And does everybody understand the strategy involved in those objectives? And there are lots of tools that you may have used before you went remote. And if you need some suggestions, there are management tools or objective management tools, things like Asana, Google Sheets. There's a local company called Align that has a really great system for helping people manage the goals and objectives that they're working on in their team. So that's the second area that we want to focus on teams. The third area are our processes and norms, right? So what is essentially the documented playbook for how we're going to work together? So we have those. We all come up when we have a highly functional team, whether we're, again, live and in person or remote. We come up with a playbook for how we're going to communicate. We set regular meetings. We have norms on how they're run. Some people, some teams have a set agenda. Someone facilitates the meeting, etc. There are these processes and norms that are in place, and we want to make sure that when you go remote, those processes and norms are transferred to your behavior when you're dispersed, right? So, what are the tools that we're going to use for communication? What kind of behavior are we going to have during our virtual meetings? What are the expectations around workflows and timeliness? And again, I'm sure because of the immediate nature of what happened with this pandemic, things around expectations concerning workflows and timeliness, with the added responsibilities, again, of homeschooling, having your kids at home, perhaps not having the resources that you may not have, you may have had, but don't have now. All of those things can impact workflows and timeliness. And if you're not communicating that with your team, it can be very, very frustrating. So again, a couple of more processes and norms. How are we going to organize the work now? Is there any kind of new prioritization that we need to think about? Do we need to change who is involved based on what is going on in this new normal? And then finally, with processes and norms, we want to think about how are decisions going to be made and how are they going to be communicated. So that's number 3 when we're thinking about the 4 key areas of what needs to be addressed in terms of teams. And the last one is probably going to be the most familiar to you guys. You're going to see that it's probably the most important, and it has to do with experimentation or adaptation. So when we have a sudden, huge change like going remote, we need to realize that there's going to be some experimentation and definitely some adaptation that happens when a big change happens. So the overall business foundation of flexibility and adaptation needs to be made very, very clear. The leadership has a responsibility to the staff to say, we know this is hard. We know we don't know everything, and we don't know how to predict everything, and things are changing day by day, week by week, month by month, and we are open to experimenting. We are open to adapting, and it's actually required. And that is going to help reduce people's fears. So the companies can start to set an example of bringing empathy and compassion to new and changing times. That's really, really important. I believe it was the head of the Hilton organization that put out a phenomenal video that really underscored the ideas of leadership understanding how critical transparency is, how critical empathy and compassion is to communicate to the staff and to the world. I wish that I actually had a link to that video because I thought it was an amazing example of leadership, but I know you can find that link on LinkedIn. And again, I'm pretty sure it was Hilton, and if it was Marriott, I'm going to be embarrassed, but one or the other of those 2 organizations put out an amazing video that underscored this idea of transparency, empathy, and compassion. And then finally, what are the mindsets that people need to adopt when experimentation and adaptation are the new norm? It's not always easy to have the idea that things are ever changing, and getting into the mindset that that is okay is really, really important. So I want to encourage people that are leading teams to keep those 4 areas. And again, those 4 areas are culture work, objectives, processes and norms, and experimentation. I urge you to kind of keep those open on your desk and check in with yourself. Have I addressed these? Are these things that I'm mindful of on my team? Have I checked in with the team around these 4 different things? So we have experimentation. And then to learn a little bit more about that framework, you can actually visit the Sanger Leadership Center's website, and it talks about that particular model. Again, I highly recommend that particular model, and I think it's very simple, easy to understand. Again, not always easy to implement, because no one ever said being a great leader was easy, but it's again, a framework that will really help you guide the process through what is a difficult transition. So as we close out, I want to acknowledge that there is a lot of fear, and that, no doubt that every organization that has suddenly gone remote has had leaders and staff that are really fearful to their core. And I've heard from my clients, and in a sense, and it sort of feels to me sometimes like these fears are endless, right? They've worried about low productivity. They've, sent me urgent texts about all of a sudden their boss is a micromanager and they don't know how to deal with it. Some of them are worried about being perceived as lazy. Some of them are worried about losing their jobs because where's the money going to come from? But whatever your fears are, I suggest that you address them, and you address them quickly, right? Because the best way to address these is to have communication, and that communication is going to build trust. It's the number one currency that really takes intention to build. It takes intention to build if we're live and in person, and it takes a lot of intention to build when we are not face to face. And really, the only way to build this currency is with empathy, compassion, transparency, and the big C word, communication. You have got to communicate quickly and openly. So, the lack of trust monster, can always be near when you're silent and letting assumptions build up. And as we started the presentation with the idea of a journey, remember that the journey isn't an easy one. We called it a marathon. Marathons aren't easy, and growth is hard, and it takes intention and it takes work. But what this pandemic has offered us is an opportunity for growth, because we're going to have to work harder to make things work. But what we learn during this time can be transmitted into when we get back to something of a different new normal. So, again, take with you that this new journey is an opportunity to grow. So I wanted to take a few minutes to let everybody know that what we talked about today, the idea of leading teams and leading teams in a remote environment, is part of the UNO PACE course, Leadership and Team Management. And we are actually having an information session tonight at 6 p.m. And we'll talk all about what that leadership course entails. We do leadership, the foundations of positive leadership. We go over strategic planning in depth. We talk about team building and leading teams. And then the final part of that course is conflict management. So a lot of the themes that we talked about today in the webinar are definitely a part of that class, and I highly encourage you to jump into that Zoom information session tonight. There is the link to that. If you go to the UNO PACE website under the Leadership and Team Management tab, there is an invite to that Zoom so that you can jump right on there. And it looks like, oh, Dan has shared that. So I want to go back and make sure that there aren't any particular questions that, let's see. Okay. So there have been a lot of comments in the chats, and again, people are talking about the idea of training and retraining, and again, going back to those foundations, figuring out how to make this new normal innovative and interesting. And I'm loving seeing the theme of things are exhausting, but it also seems like there is some hope around the idea of this new normal. Are there any other questions before we jump into the end. A good home office helps. Definitely. I think that is key. And figuring out how to make your home office comfortable is really important. I'm curious, what are some of the things that people have done to make their home office better? I can tell you that I had to immediately upgrade my internet service. I had to get Google Mesh. I had to find some better lighting. What are some of the things that other people are having to do to make things comfortable at home? Yeah, new home office furnishings. Okay, any other questions before we close out today? Someone else has created a working space. And working with other people, really helpful. I know that a lot of my clients have had to figure out how to motivate themselves to work. And one of the things that they've done is organized times during the day where everybody gets on the same call. And although it's not necessarily a shared meeting, they're all committed to getting on for several hours and working at the same time. And that has boosted their productivity. Let's see, working at much different hours. I think that people are working different hours. One company that I work with actually has instituted a 4-day work week, and they did that not because there's actually less work to do. One of the things that one of the reasons why they did that was because some of their staff was really, really busy. And some of their staff had nothing to do, but everybody was getting paid. And so the people that were working full time and doing what they would normally do were getting kind of annoyed that their coworkers were drawing a paycheck and doing gardening all the time. And so the organization wanted to acknowledge that frustration. They wanted to make things as fair as they possibly could, knowing that they were committed to continuing to pay employees as long as they possibly can. And so what they said was, okay, for anybody that wants to, we're going to go to a 4-day work week. And it actually had the exact impact that they wanted it to have. And I spoke with one of the people yesterday who has one of the busier jobs. In fact, she said, I was starting to get incredibly frustrated that I knew so many of my coworkers were drawing paychecks and not having to work. And she said, when they instituted the 4-day work week, not only did I stop working at 5 p.m., but I also immediately took them up on it. And I felt so much better that I could spend Friday, Saturday, and Sunday doing what my coworkers were getting to do all week long. And it felt better, and not just more fair, but she really did feel seen and heard by the organization. And I thought that was an amazingly intentional act that the organization did to, again, recognize that this is a tough time, it's something different, and they wanted to try and do what they could to make things fair. So it looks like some other people are, working later at night because they're having to do homeschooling during the day. Any other questions? Let's see, I'm looking through. Yeah, other people, it looks like they were having to do internet boosting as well. That looks like something that is happening quite a bit. And I can see that the idea of over-checking and micromanaging is something that came up as well. Well, I have very, very much appreciated this opportunity to talk with everybody today. I think Rachel is going to come in and close us out. There she
I
is.
am. I'm working from home with 3 other people online, so it's taking me a minute to come back in.
Okay.
Speaking of, yeah. But thank you so much, Kimberly. This has been really informative for me, and I know it has been for all of our guests, as it will be for our alums as they view it online and in repeat. So please, if anyone out there is interested in more information on this topic and others, check out the PACE link tonight for the info session, have an opportunity to learn more with Kimberly. So we really appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks
Great.
for everybody
Thank
for
you.
attending today.
Thank you. Have a good
Take
one.
care. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.